Considering the fact that a lot of people don't exercise their options well,
Yeah.
might it be beneficial if you take, say, a really extreme position that a lot of people feel really strongly about? So, like, you're guaranteed to have those people come out low, where, like, a lot of people are going to be in the middle.
Well, the question is, do you get more people on the opposite side to come out and vote against you? I mean, I don't know. So, but I think that a huge amount of political science can just be thought of as an application of these principles of product design that we've been learning. Okay. Now, Jetskow and Shapiro in 2010 used this stuff to study media slant. And what they did is they looked at local monopoly newspapers around the United States, and they thought of them as choosing their political position along a single one dimension. And they measured the slant of a newspaper by looking at the language that the newspaper used. So in particular, they went through the congressional record and they figured out what were the 100 phrases that were more used by Republicans than Democrats, and more used by Democrats than Republicans. And these, at the time, were the death tax, the Republicans used to say, or illegal aliens. And Democrats tend to use words like poor people, workers' rights, and tax breaks. And then they read in the editorials from these newspapers, or like even just the normal news content from the newspapers, and said how much more were they using Republican than Democratic language, right? And then what they did is they broke local markets into different districts. And of course, in different areas of a city, people have different politics. And then they basically, controlling for everything else, said how much did a change in that area's politics lead them to read the newspapers less. And that let them measure the transportation cost between people's position and the newspaper based on how much it led to a reduction in their purchases. And they then were able to figure out how much what position the firm should take in order to maximize the profits that they would make in that area, right? And they use that as a way to test whether newspapers choose their slant to maximize their profits, or whether they're like driven by the position of the newspaper owner, right? So what they found is that once you controlled for the politics of the area, the newspaper owner's political contributions, what the positions taken by other newspapers that he owned, all that stuff didn't matter. But basically, it was all explained by the political views of people in the district. And they used that to argue that media slant is really just catering to consumers rather than expressing the views of the people who own it, and therefore we don't need to worry too much about concentration in media. So this is sort of a graph taken from their paper. So they looked at districts in terms of their percent Republican, and they found that districts with higher percent of Republicans take much more right-wing positions. Yeah, okay.
Wait, how strong is this correlation? Because it looks pretty...
It's relatively weak, but the problem is percent Republican isn't really the right measure. You really want to instead construct something like they did, which is like a measure of how much business you'd lose from moving to the left or right. You get a better fit when you do that. But percent Republican is like sort of a proxy for that, so it's a simple thing to interpret. Yeah.
Did they interpret why, even when you have 50% market split, you're still slanted slightly Democrat?
Oh, I mean, this is not an absolute scale. You know, it's just a relative scale. So, you know. Yeah, Connor.
Did they do like a statistical test of significance to see if like the newspapers having certain messages changed people's opinions?
Yeah. Oh, to change people's opinions
so
over time.
Because
No, they didn't. They didn't. But what they did do is to make sure that it wasn't reverse causation, they instrumented for people's political positions in different areas using their demographic characteristics, like race and stuff, education, assuming that those things weren't affected by the newspaper. The one interesting thing is they also used religion, and they assumed that that wasn't affected by the newspaper stance. Turns out that's not so obvious, actually. So it turns out most people in the United States, like a huge number of people say they attend church every week, but if you actually track them, they don't. And how much they're likely to claim that they go to church is affected by their political views. So Republicans claim that they go to church a lot, but don't actually, whereas Democrats don't claim they go to church. And it turns out, like everyone, claims based on these surveys that, like, the U.S. is so much more religious than Europe, but it turns out that's all over-reporting. that basically people in France go to church just as much as people in the United States go to church. It's just that all the people in the United States claim to be going to church when they're not actually. Anyway, so one thing to notice about this newspaper case is that the reason that the newspapers were trying to get people to read it is not really because they're going to make a lot of profits off of selling the newspaper to people. It's because they want to get people to read the newspaper so that they can sell advertisements to the advertisers, right? So really the value of the readers was not as a direct profit source, but rather as a characteristic of the paper that they could then sell to advertisers, right? And so when people who purchase the who interact with the service serve both the role of producing characteristics that are sold to other customers and being customers themselves, we're going to call them users rather than consumers. And when user generation of the product characteristics is important, we call a firm a platform or a two-sided market or a network. And there's tons of examples of industries that are like this. And I think they're increasingly important in the economy. Jacob, could you give some examples?
Maybe like Facebook. Like
Yeah.
You want to target people who not only will see your thing and click on it, but then will go and buy.
Yeah. And in particular, Facebook is attractive to some customers because of the other customers that use it, right? So media platforms are the classic example. Newspapers, television, websites are all trying to attract people in order to sell them to someone else, right? Credit cards and debit cards, PayPal, are valuable to me because they're accepted by other people. Square is valuable to me because it's accepted by the food trucks, right? Operating systems, smartphones, video game systems are valuable to consumers because they have a lot of media available for them, right? And so, and on the other hand, they're valuable to the game developers because a lot of people own the consoles, right? Transaction platforms like eBay and financial markets are valuable to people who are selling things because other people are there to buy them, right? And there's lots of other examples: dating websites, shopping malls, etc. Yeah, David.
So based on like, these are obviously they have to be established first. So looking at a company like Facebook, how exactly should it, like, before it had the customers to sell to other customers?
Yeah.
Does it need to adapt its model differently from one place to another?
That's a great question. My first published paper was about that question. So the answer, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that firms may want to charge a very low price initially or subsidize consumers in order to like get up to critical mass so that they can then make profits on it. That idea is called the Insulating Tariff, and you can read about it in my paper. OK, so in platforms, users both consume and produce, right? They play both roles, right? And that leads to two different levels of distortions that are created in their participation. Remember that if you were consuming a product characteristic, that led to the Spence distortion, right? Now, if you were just buying a product, right, we had the Cournot distortion if the characteristics were fixed. Here, the people are going to have both things going on, right? Because there's going to be distortion just based on their participation and on the contribution that they make to the value of the product, right? So one classic example, an example of how this can work out is that, think about newspapers. The people who value newspapers the most are probably also the people who dislike advertising the most, right? So like inframarginal readers of the New York Times, like us, probably dislike advertising more than someone who's marginal, maybe lower income or something like that. But the newspaper, and that would lead the newspapers to put too many ads in, because they wouldn't be internalizing our utility. But on the other hand, they're going to be having too few ads because they're going to have a markup to the advertisers, right? Which will reduce the number of ads they have. So those two things offset each other, and you might have closer to the optimal number of ads than you would in the absence of either distortion, right? if you didn't have them having market power over the advertisers, that might actually lead them to put too many ads in. And if you didn't have them distorting us, you might have too few ads, right? On the other hand, things compound each other and get even worse with credit cards. Because the people who most value having a credit card are also the people who put the greatest value on getting one more merchant to accept the card. But then they're also reducing the number of merchants they have because of the distortion, because of the standard Cournot distortion, right? OK, so the formula that comes out of this, and I won't go through it, is that you set the price to a group of people equal to the marginal cost plus the marginal surplus, the usual Cournot distortion we were talking about before, minus the sum over all the other sides of the market, all the other groups of consumers who the firm is getting value from, of the number of people on that side multiplied by the expectation over the set of marginal consumers on that side of the utility that they get from having one more consumer on this side. OK. So now let me return to the concern that we had about the intensity of purchases. An example of this for a platform is that if I make the content of my newspaper worse, it might be that people still buy the newspaper. But if they read the newspaper less carefully, then they're less valuable to the advertisers because they're not going to see as many ads, right? So the amount of utility I bring people might indirectly affect my profits by impacting how much people participate in or buy of the product, right? So in that case, you can think of my cost as being a function of both the my cost as being determined by the sum over all the people who buy my product of the cost of that person. And the cost is just the negative of the benefit, right? So you could think that the profits that I make off of any given person might depend on the level of quality I supply to them. Obviously, it's going to be more costly to have a higher quality product, but also on the utility that I provide to them. If I provide them more utility, I might be able to make more money off the advertisers, right? And so let's think about that model now. My cost is going to be the number of people times the expected cost, which depends both directly on the quality, but also on the utility the quality provides to people, right? So then when I change my price, how much does that increase my cost? Well, before I just had that it was the derivative of my cost with respect to the number of people times the number of people on the margin. But now it's going to be, what's my derivative of my cost with respect to the number of people? Well, it's the average cost of the people who are on the margin. Average value of their individual cost. And that's my marginal cost. When I change the non-price instrument, right, I have two effects. So I have an effect on the boundary and an effect on the interior. On the interior, there are two things going on. There's the number of people times the direct costs that I have from increasing the quality I provide to those people. But then there's also an indirect effect on my cost, which is the marginal utility that people get from the change in the quality multiplied by the amount that my cost changes when I change the utility that I provide to those people, right? So those could offset each other potentially. If I make it a higher quality newspaper, that might be more costly. But it might also increase people's utility and allow me to make more profit off them, right? Then there's the effect on the boundary, which is there's the product of the marginal utility. That's how quickly I attract people, and the cost that those people have, right? OK. So I've assumed here, right, that all the people who are indifferent have the same utility and therefore the same cost, right? Because all the people who are on the boundary of whether to buy the product or not have a utility that's exactly equal to price and therefore will have the same cost. So in that case, really the only thing that changes, this utility can then be brought out of the expression, or sorry, this cost can then be brought out of the expression. I get the expected margin